Hi, my name's Jason Samosa and welcome to Jason Samosa's Ufology Moment. Today we're going to be focusing on the UAP hearings that just happened in the United States Senate. What did we learn? And most importantly, what does it mean for UFO disclosure moving forwards? More on that in just a second. So let's get right to this. What is it that we're looking at today? This is the testimony of the director of AARO. What is AARO? It's the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office. Where has AARO come from? Well, we had the UAP Task Force. Then we had the Airborne Object Identification Management and Synchronization Group, the AARO. AARO is the evolution of this process and has been given expanded powers and expanded remit. And now we've got the director, Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick. I'm sure he's a lovely guy. I'm sure he's a wonderful, wonderful man, if not a little bit dull. But thankfully, we do learn some fascinating stuff, and some of it looks really good because there are commitments being made here, and you wouldn't make commitments unless you at least had some plan on following through with them. So, with all of that said, let's get into it.
To the bottom of the very serious anomaly unidentified anomalous phenomenon or UAP. Congress established this office. Dr. Kirkpatrick.
Well, they should call this the UAP talkings, I think, not the UAP hearings. Anyone? I'm pretty sure I just clicked on the wrong video. Let me find the right one. Here we are.
Hearing will come to order. I'd first like to thank our witness, Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick, for testifying here and in today's earlier closed session, and for his long and distinguished career. Congress established this office in law to get to the bottom of the very serious problem of unidentified anomalous phenomenon, or UAP. In late 2017, media reports surfaced about activity set in motion by the late long-serving Majority Leader, Senator Harry Reid, more than a decade ago. We learned that there was strong evidence of advanced technology reflected in the features and performance characteristics of many objects observed by our highly trained service members operating top-of-the-line military equipment. We learned that for the past 8 years, military pilots frequently encountered unknown objects in controlled airspace off both the east and west coast across the continental United States in test and training areas and ranges. We don't know where they come from, who made them, or how they operate. As former Deputy Secretary of Defense David Norquist observed, had any of these objects had the label made in China, there would be an uproar in the government and media. Because of the UFO stigma, the response has been irresponsibly anemic and slow. Congress established AARO. We made it clear that we expect vigorous action. We added very substantial initial funding for the office, but despite our best efforts, the President's budget for fiscal years 23 and 24 requested only enough funding to defray the operating expenses of AARO. It included almost no funds to sustain the critical research and development necessary to support a serious investigation. It took a letter to Secretary Austin from Senator Rubio and me and 14 other senators to get the office temporary relief for the current fiscal year.
This little introduction here, I think, really sets the tone and helps us to understand the dynamics of what's been going on. So here is Senator Gillibrand, right? And there's a bunch of other senators and congressmen and women who have been informed of what's been going on for ages, which is that there are unknown objects that fighter pilots are interacting with on sometimes an almost daily basis. This had not been reported up to the House, to Congress, to the Senate. It had been kept silent for years until 2017 when it all came out through, insiders coming out and starting to talk about this. As a consequence, Senator Gillibrand and a bunch of other people are not happy. They feel like they've been lied to. They feel like the American people have been lied to about a massive incursion into the US airspace. And as she just said, if these objects had made in China written on the side of them, what would happen? There would be uproar. And yet there has been the exact opposite. If you listen to people who have been in dialogue with senators and congressmen and women, they will tell you that they are angry. Here is journalist Ross Coulthart talking about this.
A lot of people in the defense and intelligence community have forgotten in America that it's not the bloody intelligence community and defense community that run America. It's Congress. And mate, Congress has found its balls. Believe me, the oversight committees have got teeth and they're using it because they realize they've been lied to. I've actually had conversations with people in Congress who've told me they're aware now that they've been misled and they are determined to get to the truth of this. And people like Kirkpatrick know where history is going. He's leading a unit which has been legislatively mandated to tell the truth about UAPs. The Congress has made an order.
There are a few other introductions here and a few other introductory remarks, but I'll skip over and we'll get straight to Dr. Kirkpatrick.
Thank you, Chairwoman Gillibrand, Ranking Member Ernst, distinguished members of the subcommittee. It's a privilege to be here today to testify on the defense's efforts to address unidentified anomalous phenomena. In the 9 months since AARO's establishment, we've taken important steps to involve and improve UAP data collection. Meanwhile, consistent with legislative direction, AARO is also carefully reviewing and researching the U.S. government's UAP-related historical record.
This is really encouraging. It'd be very easy for him to say, look, we've got so many cases that we're just going to focus on the ones that are coming in. We're not going to go and dig through that historical record. But he is saying here, on the record, that they're going to be looking through historical cases as well. That is really encouraging, and it's just the first of many indicators that Dr. Kirkpatrick is going to be very ambitious with this project.
I want to underscore today that only a very small percentage of UAP reports display signatures that could reasonably be described as anomalous. The majority of unidentified objects reported to AARO demonstrate mundane characteristics of balloons, unmanned aerial systems, clutter, natural phenomena, or other readily explainable sources. While a large number of cases in our holdings remain technically unresolved, this is primarily due to a lack of data associated with those cases. Without sufficient data, we are unable to reach defendable conclusions that meet the high scientific standards we set for resolution. Time and again, with sufficient scientific quality data, it is fact that UAP often, but not always, resolve into readily explainable sources. Getting to the handful of cases that pass this level of scrutiny is the mission of AARO.
It's really interesting to get a sense of the contrast between Gillibrand, who is really emphasizing that sense of the unknown. There are things in the skies that we're interacting with, we don't know what they are, whereas Kirkpatrick seems really determined to bring that sensationalism down and to say, look, there is a whole bunch of things that we're looking at, and the vast majority of it is going to be nothing. 95, 99, maybe 99.9% of cases are nothing but mistakes, misunderstandings, objects that you haven't seen before, or, whatever. They will be explainable using traditional explanations or the existing inventory and technologies that we have. It still remains the case that there are a small fraction of a large number of cases that are relatively incredible. As Major John Sanford said in Project Blue Book,
there have been a certain percentage of this volume of reports that have been made by credible observers of relatively incredible things.
That was in 1952. We're in 2023. That remains the same. This statement from Kirkpatrick, it seems to be trying to calm sensationalism, but it doesn't change the fact the reason this is happening is because there are anomalous cases. The encouraging thing is he's coming at it from a very rational scientific perspective, which I think ultimately is going to serve the purpose of making their conclusions authoritative. So this is actually a real positive.
The U.S. government, the DoD and the IC in particular, has tremendous capabilities to deal with those encountered objects. Meanwhile, for the few cases in all domains, space, air, and sea,
that's really encouraging. To understand why that's so important, think back to the AOIMSG, the Airborne Object Identification Management and Synchronization Group. By the way, in the defense community, they always come up with good acronyms. Let me give you a few examples here. There's Magic Carpet, the Maritime Augmented Guidance and Integrated Controls for Carrier Approach and Recovery Precision Enabling Technologies. There's Dr. Bob, which is the Defense Resale Business Optimization Board. There's DISCO, which is the Defense Industrial Security Clearance Office. Prime Beef, the Prime Base Engineer Emergency Force. And then you've got the Airborne Object Identification Management and Synchronization Group. The Department of Defense actually has a long track record for making a real effort with the names of their programs. And so this really stands out almost as an intentional effort to obfuscate this subject and to prevent it from being spoken about on the news, in the media, and throughout Congress. So the fact that we've moved beyond the Steve Aoki, the fact that we've moved beyond Steve Aoki pizza into AARO is encouraging just from that perspective, but it also broadens the scope. See, the Airborne Object Identification Management Synchronization Group was only about airborne objects. AARO is the all-domain anomaly resolution office. So now we're talking about transmedium travel. We are talking about, as Kirkpatrick just said,
all domains, space, air, and sea.
this is a much broader scope, and for anyone who's been paying attention to the UAP subject, we all know that UAPs are not just things in the air. That's why we've gone from unidentified flying object to unidentified aerial phenomena to now unidentified anomalous phenomena.
Unidentified anomalous phenomena.
The all-domain anomaly resolution office is focused on objects in the air, in space, and in the ocean, because there are sightings in all three, and that's very important.
This chart represents the trend analysis of all the cases in AARO's holdings, right, to date. What you'll see on the left is a histogram of all of our reported sightings as a function of altitude. So most of our sightings occur in the 15 to 25,000 foot range. On the far right upper corner, you'll see a breakout of the morphologies of all of the UAP that are reported. Over half are round orb spheres. The bottom map is a heat map of all reporting areas across the globe that we have available to us. What you'll notice is that there is a heavy, what we call collection bias, both in altitude and in geographic location. That's where all of our sensors exist. In the middle, what we have done is reduce the most typically reported UAP characteristics to these fields, mostly round, mostly 1 to 4 meters, white, silver, translucent, metallic, 10,000 to 30,000 feet with apparent velocities from stationary to Mach 2. No thermal exhausts usually detected. We get intermittent radar returns, we get intermittent radio returns, and we get intermittent thermal signatures. That's what we're looking for and trying to understand what that is.
That's awesome. What's really interesting there is the collection bias issue. So this idea that the vast majority of sightings are occurring between 10 and 30,000 feet. That's because that's where our planes are, and that the vast majority of sightings are happening in those hotspots because that's where military activity is occurring. But what's really interesting is the morphology. I was not expecting that at all. It's very interesting when we talk about UAP. We often think of flying saucers, sort of flat and round, or triangle-shaped craft has been overwhelmingly what I have heard about or learned from research or different cases. But here, they found that over half of them are spherical. That's very interesting. The morphology is a fascinating one because that's not going to be subject to the same kind of collection bias that the other kinds of data are. And if this is just the beginning, then I think we've got a lot to look forward to in terms of what we can learn on UAP.
So I'm going to walk you through 2 cases that we've declassified recently. This first one is an MQ-9 in the Middle East.
I just had to look up what an MQ-9 was. An MQ-9 is an unmanned aerial vehicle that clearly has a camera on it. So UAV, unmanned aerial vehicle, also known as an MQ-9.
Observing that blow up, which is an apparent spherical object via EO sensors. Those are not IR. You'll see it come through the top of the screen. There it goes. And then the camera will slew to follow it. You'll see it pop in and out of the field of view there. This is essentially all of the data we have associated with this event from some years ago. Now, what we can do and what we are doing is keeping that as part of that group of 52% to see what are the similarities, what are the trends across all of these, do we see these in a particular distribution, do they all behave the same or not? As we get more data, we will be able to go back and look at these in a fuller context. Next slide.
It's great to get a video, but personally, I'm not excited by that. That doesn't strike me as a video that has any interesting observables that you could describe as truly anomalous. All we can say about that case is we don't know what that thing is, but there are no anomalous observables that we can take hold of to say, not only do we not know what this is, but who on earth could make something like this or pilot something like this? There's a difference there. I suppose in that sense, it's representative of what AARO is doing, which is the vast majority of what they're going to do is pretty dull. They're going to look at all anomalous phenomena that appear to people, and of course, 99.9% of it is going to be dull, ordinary stuff, balloons, etc. So perhaps important for us to see that.
And I believe that's all I have, and I will open it up for your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kirkpatrick. Can you just give us some raw numbers of how many UAPs you've analyzed, how many have been resolved, and sort of in what buckets, and then how many are still left to be resolved? Just an update from your January public report where it was 366 or something, and about 150 were balloons and about 24 were drones. Just give us an update if you have one.
Sure. So as of this week, we are tracking over a total of 650 cases. We have essentially a 5-step process, right? So we get our cases in with all the data. We create a case for that event. My team does a preliminary scrub of all of those cases as they come in, just to sort out, do we have any information that says this is in one of those likely categories, or we don't know. Then we prioritize those based off of where they are. Are they attached to a national security area? Does it show some anomalous phenomenology that is of interest? If it's just a spherical thing that's floating around with the wind and it has no payload on it, that's going to be less important than something that has a payload on it, which will be less important than something that's maneuvering, right? So there's sort of a hierarchy of just binning the priorities because we can't do all of them at once. Once we do that and we prioritize them, when we take that package of data in that case, and I have set up 2 teams. Think of this as a red team, blue team, or a competitive analysis. I have an intelligence community team made up of intelligence analysts, and I have an S&T team made up of scientists and engineers and the people that actually build a lot of these sensors, or physicists, because if you're a physicist, you can do anything. But they're not associated with the intel community. They're not intel officers. So they look at this through the lens of the sensor, of what the data says. We give that package to both teams. The intelligence community is going to look at it through the lens of the intelligence record and what they assess, and their intel tradecraft, which they have very specific rules and regulations on how they do that. Scientific community, technical community is going to look at it through the lens of what is the data telling me, what is the sensor doing, what would I expect a sensor response to be, and back that out. Those 2 groups give us their answers. We then adjudicate. If they agree, then I am more likely to close that case if they agree on what it is. If they disagree, we will have an adjudication. We'll bring them together, we'll take a look at the differences, we'll adjudicate why do you say one thing and you say another. We will then come to a case recommendation. That'll get written up by my team. That then goes to a senior technical advisory group, which is outside of all of those people, and they essentially peer review what that case recommendation is. That comes back to me, I review it, we make a determination, and I'll sign off one way or the other, and then that will go out as the case determination.
Well, that was an extremely detailed and interesting insight into how AARO is working. We've got this 5-step process. What I love there is that red team, blue team approach, that adversarial approach to try and bring out the nuances of what each individual perspective might not see. That's awesome. I love the fact that we're getting to see the innards, the logic, the process, the structure of how they're going to be looking at this issue. Even though Kirkpatrick is pretty dull, what he's saying is quite exciting. So at least we've got that.
That's, in a nutshell, that is the process. So go back to your question, ma'am. We have, I think we're currently sitting at around 20 to 30-ish are about halfway through that analytic process. A handful of them have made it all the way out to the other side, gone through peer review. We've got case closure reports done and signed. We're going to get faster as we get more people on board and we get more of the community tools to automate some of the analysis that has to be done.
Wow. I mean, the first thing to say there is that's really slow progress. It's not a criticism, because clearly the process that's been described here is rigorous, but that's slow progress. They've got 650 reports. They have 20 or 30 that are some way through the process of being analyzed, and we're 9 months into AARO as an office. When you take into account these figures and this analysis, does it seem unreasonable to say that we're not going to get any serious, meaningful conclusions for at least a year or two until, we've got enough anomalous cases to really say, like, hey, here's what we found? Rigorous science might mean slow conclusions.
Is it possible that the Chinese or Russian advanced technologies could could be causing some of these anomalous behaviors? And could you describe potential threat that might exist out there?
There are emerging capabilities out there that in many instances, Russia and China, well, China in particular, are on par or ahead of us in some areas. The adversary is not waiting. They are advancing, and they're advancing quickly. They are less risk averse at technical advancement than we are. Right? They are just willing to try things and see if it works. Are there capabilities that could be employed against us in both an ISR and a weapons fashion? Absolutely. Do I have evidence that they're doing it in these cases? No, but I have concerning indicators.
You know, this is actually a really good time to stop and ask, who is Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick? Who is this man that we're all listening to who's been tasked with this enormous responsibility? Sean Kirkpatrick is 53 years old, and he graduated from the University of Georgia with a PhD in physics. He's an accomplished physicist with 58 scientific papers to his name on highly technical subjects that I wouldn't understand. He has gone on to perform senior roles in the CIA, the NRO, the National Reconnaissance Office, who own the night in terms of satellites, the Air Force. He's been CTO and division chief for joint CIA and DIA programs. And then he's taken on some very senior roles. So being a senior intelligence advisor to the director of the DIA, the deputy director of intelligence for the US Space Command, and the chief scientist at the DIA Missile and Space Intelligence Center. These are big, very senior roles. So important to remember this when we watch this person sitting here talking. You know, my first impression was, oh, this is a backroom bureaucrat. Well, I mean, maybe that is true, but I think it's also true to say that Sean Kirkpatrick is an extremely senior technical officer who has a lot of experience in the worlds of defense, space, and satellites. And actually, when you dig deep and you find old interviews with this guy talking at various conferences, you definitely get a sense of that vibe. This is from an Armed Forces Communications Conference on April 13th, 2021. Dr. Kirkpatrick said, their weaponization of space, referring to Russia and China, in the space domain and to space from the ground has really progressed significantly over the last 20 years. They have pursued nearly every type of counter-space weapon that you can think of, and they have built them. They have tested them, and they are proliferating them in an operational environment. I have to be able to see and metaphorically hear everything that's going on between 100 kilometers off the face of the planet to wherever we are. And right now we can't do that. And finally, in a report in Air Force magazine by Amanda Miller, May 7th, 2021, we've got a huge moon competition going on. We've got a Mars competition going on. Multiple countries are heading out. We are going to have to extend our mission space to the cislunar, lunar, and Martian orbits and regimes at some point in the not too distant future. Now, why am I bringing all of this up? This is a person who is very familiar with the narrative that there is a threat in space that we need to defend from. Now, this raises concerns, I think, for anyone who is asking, why is this disclosure happening? And I'm not saying that Kirkpatrick has bad motivations. I'm not saying that this disclosure necessarily is about encouraging us to weaponize space. I personally think this would be a very strange way to go about that. However, this does give us some context to the things he's saying in this session. So when he says,
are there capabilities that could be employed against us in both an ISR and a weapons fashion? Absolutely.
That may not just be coming from the UAP data. Part of that may also be coming from the huge amount of experience he's had dealing with those kinds of issues in all of these various roles. Interesting stuff. I'm not going to make any further comments. I want to see how things play out, but I certainly think it changes your perspective on what's going on when you have all this extra data surrounding the man and the mythos of Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick.
First thing that we're doing is normalizing our reporting, right? We're standardizing our reporting and the requirements associated with that. Guidance from the Joint Staff, I think, goes out maybe this week, maybe next week, that we've been working with them for some months that does exactly what I just said. It gives them timelines, it gives them requirements, it gives them, here's all the data you have to have, and you got to retain it. I need to work with the commands and with the IC and with our outside of our DoD and IC partners to extend our collection posture targeted at some of these key areas that you saw on that heat map that have a lot of activity, so that we can turn on extra collection when an operator sees something. So part of this is generating as a response function, what we call a tactic, technique, and procedure for an operator. When he sees something, calls back to the operations floor, they can turn on additional collection. What does that collection look like? How do I bring all that together so I can get more data on what is that thing?
What AARO is doing is they're not just resting on the cases that they're being given. They've got 650 cases already. They're going to be getting more. But what they're doing is they're opening the floodgates of where they can get data from. And what this indicates is that Dr. Kirkpatrick, he's not just going to be passively responding to cases that come in, but he is proactively asking, how can we tap into all the possible data sources to really deal with this question? So far, we've got a bunch of things he said. Firstly, there was the historical data that he touched on, saying we're going to be going back in time to old cases. There's also sensor data that he's messaged here, saying that he's working with the Joint Chiefs of Staff to ensure that they're getting all the possible sensor data from all the different locations. And that sensor data is going to be raw and unfiltered, because one of the issues they've been experiencing is that when you are collecting data from these sensors, they're often filtered to avoid distractions or extra data coming in that distracts from the standard missions of those sensors. They're going to have access to the unfiltered raw data. That means those sensors are not just aimed towards detecting, say, fighter jets, but actually are opened up to a broader set of possible data. As well as this, there's the conversation about witnesses coming forward.
As you know, Dr. Kirkpatrick, Congress has mandated that your office establish a discoverable and accessible electronic method for potential witnesses of UAP incidents and potential participants in government UAP-related activities to contact your office and tell their stories. Congress also set up a process whereby people subject to non-disclosure agreements, preventing them from disclosing what they may have witnessed or participated in, could tell you what they know without risk of retribution. Have you submitted a public-facing website product for approval to your superiors, and how long has it been under review?
I have. We submitted the first version of that before Christmas. Thank you all very much for referring the witnesses that you have thus far to us. I appreciate that. We've brought in nearly 24 so far. I'd ask that you continue to do that until we have an approved plan. Once that happens, then we should be able to push all that out and get this a little more automated.
So you get a sense here that they are trying to figure out where can we get all the possible information. At least it looks like lots of different people and lots of different sensors are going to be leveraged to try and get as full a picture as possible within the constraints that are there. That to me is at least slightly positive.
Can you give us an update on sort of how you collaborate with the academic community and whether how the independent study being done by NASA complements AARO's work?
Where NASA comes in is really looking at the unclassified data sources that might be used to augment our classified data sources to understand if there's a signature there we can pull on. So for example, we have a lot of climate science satellites that look at Earth, lots of them. How many of those is the data valuable in seeing these kinds of objects? That is what NASA is focused on right now. What are some other data sources that could be used? In addition, things like open source and crowdsourcing of data. We're exploring public-private partnerships, ma'am, as you know, we've talked about in the past, to look at, is there a way to smartly crowdsource additional data that might be useful to augment some of my classified sources? And what does that look like? And how would we do it so that we're not overwhelmed by, everybody who wants to take a picture of everything?
This is amazing. Again, I want to come back to this theme of data because there are so many different places that AARO is going to be pulling data from. We've got the 650 cases, the historical cases, the sensor data, that raw sensor data. We've got witnesses, but now he's also talking about satellites that have no clear military application, but may have additional data that we can pull on, and even crowdsourcing and open sourcing data. You know what this reminds me of? This reminds me of when To the Stars Academy of Arts and Sciences launched, and Lou Elizondo was harping on about something called Scout. And the idea of Scout was literally what's being talked about here. It would pull data in from all of these places, video and classified documentation and different reporting, satellite data, air reconnaissance data, flight tracking applications, all of this. It would pull data in from everywhere and use AI to start analyzing and creating insights about what it is that all of this means.
When you first came out of the Pentagon, I remember one of your first ideas was the AI. So, thinking about some of the challenges that you've outlined, where there are things we're not thinking about or things that exist that we're not looking at, how to bring them all together. Do you think that is the new process that needs to be built? The new process of reporting UAP, potentially take all forms of data into one spot?
If I want to find something, for example, that's at 80,000 feet, that's flying at that high, I might use one radar system. If I want to find something that's flying 50 feet above the water, I would normally use another radar system. And if I want to find something that's, underwater 50 feet, I would use another capability. And those three capabilities don't usually talk. So what we're trying to do here is trying to help the US government recognize that those three systems all need to talk to each other. Because if you have an event, one moment at 80,000 feet, and now the next moment that same event occurs at 50 feet above the water, and then the next moment that same event is occurring now 50 feet below the surface, you need to be able to see that. And right now, those systems don't necessarily talk with each other. Keep in mind, the vault's going to have all sorts of other data sets. Again, it's going to have ship AIS. It's going to have flight tracker information. It's going to have satellite trajectories, real-time going overhead. So it will very quickly be able to tell you what you're looking at is, for example, a military exercise, and they're likely dropping flares. It's going to just help us. It's going to help the government because it's going to crunch all sorts of data. Remember, flight tracker data, weather anomaly data, bird migration data. Pretty much, if it can be ingested from a database, it's going to be considered.
That's very similar to what's being spoken about here. If this was a reactive, passive office focused on reviewing cases that came to them, that would be one thing. But this is why I'm optimistic about this. It's the active approach here. It seems that Dr. Kirkpatrick is open to any kind of data that can help him answer a question. I don't see why else he would be talking about so many different data sources and being so ambitious in a public setting. Because in some sense, by saying these things, he's kind of committing to you, to I, and to the senators who want to hold his feet to the fire. He's committing things to them. He's committing things to us. I am encouraged by this. Very encouraged.
Just talk a little bit about your logistics, who you report to, how that's going, whether you need different reporting lines. By congressional legislation, your office is administratively located with the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence and Security, but you're not substantively subordinate to the Undersecretary. Rather, you are a direct report to the Deputy Secretary. Are you taking direction directly from the Deputy Secretary? Are you able to meet and brief the Deputy Secretary?
I currently report to USDINS until they come up with the plan for how they're going to implement legislation. DOD and DNI are working through that now. I'd have to refer you back to USDINS on what their plan is.
Do I need to update your reporting structure in the next defense bill, or is this something that you think will work its way out, or does it need further clarity?
I think they're planning on coming back to you with an answer on what that plan is, and I think at that time that will inform what you want to do.
Okay, thank you.
This is quite a touchy point, I think. For anyone who's been following this kind of whole disclosure movement, you might be familiar with some of what Lou Elizondo and Chris Mellon have articulated in their struggles around ATIP. Why did Lou quit the Department of Defense and quit ATIP? The answer to that can be heard in a whole bunch of different podcasts and interviews. The issue was that they had done a study of UAP. They had identified a bunch of observables, and they felt that they posed some massive question or potentially some kind of threat that the Secretary of Defense should know about. They were trying to report that data up through the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, but they weren't getting anywhere.
It's really interesting, and it varies considerably. And this started actually when Lou was still in the Pentagon. And I was introducing him to some people who were close to General Mattis and trying to get this on the Secretary's radar, actually get a briefing to his level, because the normal systems weren't working, and the naval fighter pilots were out there confronting these things, and nobody was taking it up the chain of command to take any action to support them.
There seemed to be some motivations, some philosophical or practical political reasons why they didn't want to bring this issue right up to Secretary of Defense James Mattis. And as a consequence, despite having loads of data and a compelling case that this was a real phenomenon, they couldn't get this issue raised up. And that's why Lou Elizondo quit the Pentagon, or at least according to his testimony. This raises the point. If we are going to be collecting data on UAP, How are we going to ensure that that data doesn't end up getting stuck in this reporting process again? So the question that's being asked here by Senator Gillibrand is really important, because the higher in the executive branch, the higher in the chain of command that we can get this office to report into, the more likely it is that the insights that are provided will be acted upon. The issue pre-2017 was that despite having excellent data, the reporting mechanisms didn't allow for this very important issue to take hold. What Gillibrand is pushing for here with AARO is that we don't just report into the Undersecretary of Defense, but that AARO reports directly into the Deputy Secretary of Defense. That's a big step up. It seems what Kirkpatrick is saying here is that that's not actually really happening just yet. And so you can see Gillibrand is planning to take some kind of action. This whole thing as well really represents the politics and the conflict and what I would even call a kind of a war over UAPs within the Pentagon. Those politics continue to this day. I am 100% convinced of that. And I think this tension about where this office reports into reflects some of that.
Do you have anything else you'd like to tell the committee before we close?
Thank you very much for allowing us to come and share a little bit of insight into what AARO is up to and what we're doing. I hope to be able to share a whole lot more in the future. We have a lot of work to do, so if you don't hear from me outside, it's because we've got a lot of work to do.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Kirkpatrick. Thank you for the hearing.
Thank you.
Now, there's one final elephant in the room that I'd like to address. And it's this. Isn't it the case that people within the Department of Defense already know that there is an anomalous phenomenon? For anyone who's been following this issue, I think it's quite clear that there are people who already have answers to the questions that Dr. Kirkpatrick is asking. And if that's the case, then what is this? Is this some kind of theatre? Is this just for show? When Lou Elizondo and Tom DeLonge and all these other people came out and started talking about disclosure, they actually were very clear that disclosure was going to be a gradual and controlled process. Here are a couple of interview clips where they explain that in a bit of detail.
One of the things I've heard in a lot of the conversations about ufology is whether the populace could handle a disclosure. What are your thoughts on that?
I think they can handle it. I think that there's elements of it that probably would be very hard to handle, and maybe a lot of people can't, but I don't think that's the stuff that needs to come first. You know, it's kind of like telling your kids that terrorists exist, but you don't need to necessarily tell them about people's heads getting chopped off. But later on, once you understand a little bit more about the world, our capabilities, what we do about it, we know how to stop the bad guys. Then it's like you can handle the conversations of what the bad guys do.
In the same respect, there's a lot of people who are impatient for information, and rightfully so. I get it. We're human beings. We want our information. We want it now, and why are you holding back? But sometimes you have to let the right people in the right positions digest information, right? Sometimes you can't expect a 10-course meal to be digested all in one bite. It just can't happen. And for some people, this UAP issue, they're really learning about it for the first time, despite what they may have seen on popular TV or something like that, or maybe on a movie. This is really the first time they're being told, hey, listen, Jack or Jane, this is a serious topic. This is something that your Department of Defense has been tracking. You probably want to learn a little bit more about what's going on and what they're seeing.
I love that analogy of the 8-course meal. It's really helpful. And it's also really helpful that they talked about it so early, because it gives us a bit of context for what's going on here. Yes, I do think there is a bit of theatrics going on here. It's not all drama, it's not all play, it's real, but it would be 100% possible for them to bring all 8 dishes out onto the table all at once. My guess is they fear the consequences if they do that. They fear the impact on society. They fear a huge rise in the mistrust of government because of secrets that have been kept. And there may be a bunch of other reasons and motivations. But whatever they are, the fact of the matter is, it's clear that disclosure is going to be a slow and controlled process. And I think what we've seen with this hearing is course number 2 has landed firmly on our tables. Disclosure is happening, however slow it might be, and course 3 will come in due course. For me, I'm excited. I have so many more questions, but actually, reflecting on this, I feel encouraged more than ever. I would love to hear what you think. Write in the comments your perspectives. I'm assuming some people are going to be very skeptical. Some people will be encouraged. I want to hear all of it. I've really enjoyed engaging with everyone in the chat. It's been an absolute blast so far. My name is Jason Samosa. This has been Jason Samosa's Ufology Moment. And until next time, cheers.